What would you do if someone humiliated you in front of a crowd? Not because of anything you did, but simply because of how you looked. Imagine being 7 months pregnant, boarding a first-class flight for a long journey, only to be treated like you don't belong there. That's exactly what happened to Ileana Reyes. But what the flight attendant didn't know was that Ileana was married to the owner of the airline. This twist turned a moment of humiliation into one of the most powerful lessons about prejudice, respect, and accountability. The airport terminal buzzed with the low hum of conversations, rolling suitcases, and the occasional announcement over the intercom. Travelers of all kinds, families, business people, young adventurers, milled about, each lost in their own world, focused on reaching their destination. Amid the organized chaos stood Ileana Reyes, gently cradling her 7-month pregnant belly with one hand while clutching her boarding pass in the other. Ileana was tall, graceful, with smooth, dark skin that glowed under the fluorescent airport lights. Her natural curls were pulled into a soft bun, a few wisps framing her face, which reflected both exhaustion and hope. Her black maternity dress hugged her rounded belly, paired with a light beige cardigan and flat shoes. Comfort was a priority for today's journey. The flight announcement echoed through the terminal. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 237 to Los Angeles. Ileana inhaled deeply, feeling the flutter of her baby inside. Traveling this far along in her pregnancy wasn't easy, but she had promised her parents a visit before the baby arrived. The plan had been simple: fly first class for comfort, stay a few days with her family, and then return home with stories and gifts before settling into the final months of her pregnancy. Her husband, Rafael Reyes, had been adamant about ensuring she was as comfortable as possible. "I'll book you first class," he had said over breakfast a week ago, sliding the plane ticket across the table. "No economy seats cramping your legs. I want you and the baby safe and relaxed." Rafael wasn't just a loving husband. He was also the CEO and owner of the very airline Ileana would be flying with. But that fact didn't matter much to Ileana. She didn't matter much to Ileana. She didn't like special treatment. She wanted to be seen and respected like everyone else. That's why she hadn't told anyone at the gate who she was. To them, she was just another passenger. Ileana approached the boarding gate, where a polite airline employee smiled and scanned her ticket. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Reyes. If you need any assistance during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Ileana smiled back. "Thank you, that's very kind." She made her way down the jet bridge, dragging a small carry-on behind her. Every step felt a little heavier than usual, her pregnant belly causing her balance to shift more than it used to, but she felt excited. This would be one of her last big trips before the baby arrived. As she stepped onto the plane, the cool air hit her face, and a sense of calm washed over her. The first-class cabin was serene. Wide, plush leather seats lined the rows, separated by generous aisles. A few passengers were already seated, some flipping through magazines, others busying themselves with their phones. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the smell of freshly brewed coffee added to the cabin's relaxing ambience. Ileana found her seat easily. One ebb, a window seat, just as she'd requested. She placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, gently lowering herself into the plush seat. It was perfect. She adjusted a small pillow behind her back and sighed, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time that day. Her hand drifted to her belly, feeling a small kick. "Almost there, little one," she whispered, smiling. For a brief moment, all was peaceful. She took a sip from the bottle of water she had brought, glancing out the window at the tarmac where ground crews busied themselves around the plane. She thought about how this trip would be her last little adventure before her world changed forever. But that peace shattered almost instantly. A sharp, cold voice pierced the air. "Ma'am, you must be in the wrong seat." Ileana turned to see a flight attendant towering over her. She wore the airline's signature navy blue uniform, perfectly pressed, with a crisp white shirt and a red neck scarf. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her name tag read Miss Parker. But it was her expression that stood out. The tight lips, narrowed eyes, and a subtle but unmistakable glare that dripped with judgment. "I'm sorry," Ileana asked, momentarily confused. Miss Parker sighed heavily, as if she had repeated this conversation many times before. "This is a first-class cabin. I believe you're supposed to be in economy." Ileana felt her chest tighten. She had heard this kind of tone before, the kind laced with assumptions, the kind that suggested she didn't belong. She tried to keep her voice steady as she reached into her bag, pulling out her boarding pass. "I'm in seat Muneb," she said, showing the ticket. Miss Parker glanced at it, barely reading it before pushing it back toward Ileana. "First class is for premium passengers. Are you sure this is your seat?" Ileana blinked, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes, my husband booked it." Miss Parker's eyes flicked to Ileana's belly, then back to her face. There was a pause, a silent, heavy moment filled with judgment. Did someone buy it for you? Ileana's heart pounded. The implication stung. "My husband," she repeated, firmer this time. "He booked it for me." Around them, the cabin had grown quieter. A few passengers pretended not to listen, but their eyes darted between Ileana and the flight attendant. Curiosity piqued. Miss Parker straightened her posture, lips pursed. "I'll have to check with the front desk. In the meantime, I'm going to need you to move to economy so we can finish boarding." Ileana's hands tightened on the armrests. Her protective instincts kicked in, both for herself and her unborn child. She could feel the humiliation washing over her, but she wasn't about to back down. "You can check," Ileana said, voice calm but firm, "but I'm staying in my seat." Miss Parker's patience snapped. Her nostrils flared, and her voice lowered to a sharp whisper. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but you don't belong here. Don't make this difficult." Ileana's breath caught in her throat. She had heard that phrase before. "You don't belong here." It had followed her in different forms throughout her life. But now, sitting here, visibly pregnant, she felt the words cut deeper than ever. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly. "I'm not moving," she repeated. The flight attendant's expression darkened. "If you don't cooperate, I will have security remove you." Tears threatened to prick Ileana's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was not going to be humiliated into submission. "Do what you need to," she said, her voice steady. It was at that exact moment that Miss Parker's composure broke. In one swift motion, she raised her hand and slapped Ileana across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the cabin, sharp and jarring. Gasps filled the air. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth in horror. A businessman sitting a few rows back awkwardly adjusted his tie, looking away. Ileana's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning. For a second, everything felt surreal, like it wasn't really happening. She touched her face, the sting confirming it was all too real. Her heart pounded in her ears, but she refused to cry. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She opened her messages and typed quickly. She slapped me. She hit send. She sat there, stunned, the murmurs of passengers swirling around her. No one had intervened. No one had stopped it. She was alone at this moment. But she wasn't going to be for long. Her phone buzzer. Raphael. What? Who did? What's your flight number? Eliana's fingers moved quickly as she typed out the details, her hands still shaking. For the first time since she boarded, she allowed herself to feel fear, but also a sense of strength. She wasn't going to let this stand. Her husband, the owner of this airline, was about to find out exactly what had happened. And when he did, nothing would ever be the same again. The sting on Eliana's cheek was nothing compared to the emotional weight that bore down on her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the whispers now swirling through the cabin. She sat frozen, her hand still pressed lightly to her face where Miss Parker had slapped her. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers, some filled with shock, others with pity, and many more with uncomfortable indifference. The cabin buzzed with low murmurs, like the hum of an approaching storm, yet no one spoke directly to her. They whispered behind cupped hands or into the ears of seatmates, their glances darting toward Eliana and away, as if making direct eye contact with her might somehow pull them into the scene they all desperately wished to avoid. Eliana's phone buzzed again in her lap. Raphael, I'm calling corporate now. Stay put. Don't let them move you. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief mixed with humiliation. Her husband was a man of power, not just wealthy but respected in the industry. She trusted him to make this right, but the fact that she needed him to, that she couldn't fight this battle alone, stung just as deeply as the slap. She shifted in her seat, feeling the burn in her cheek start to fade into a dull ache. A soft voice startled her.
Are you all right, dear?
Eliana turned to see an older woman sitting across the aisle, her silver hair neatly curled, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched her handbag. The woman's blue eyes were kind, but filled with worry. She was one of the few who had dared to speak up. Eliana managed a weak smile. I'm okay, she whispered, though the knot in her throat made her voice waver. The woman hesitated, then leaned in slightly. I saw what she did. It was appalling. Someone should have said something. Eliana's smile faded, but no one did. The woman's face flushed, her eyes dropping to her lap. She fumbled with the clasp on her purse. Eliana didn't say anything more. What could she say? The woman's reaction was honest, painfully so. People often didn't know what to do when injustice happened right in front of them. The instinct to stay silent, to avoid conflict, often won out. Just then, Miss Parker returned from the front of the cabin. Her heels clicked sharply against the carpeted floor as she strode back toward Eliana's seat. Her face was flushed, her jaw set tightly, but her composure had cracks in it now, small signs of uncertainty.
Mom, Miss Parker said curtly, I'm going to have to ask you one last time to move to economy.
Eliana raised her chin, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. No. Miss Parker's nostrils flared, but before she could respond, the cabin intercom crackled overhead. Miss Parker, please report to the cockpit immediately.
There was a pause, a beat of tense silence, before Miss Parker stiffened and walked briskly to the front of the plane without another word. Eliana could almost feel the shift in the air, the sense that something was finally happening behind the scenes.
The whispers in the cabin grew louder. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity heightened. Some craned their necks to try and see what was going on at the front of the plane. A man in a business suit pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, likely sending a message about what he'd just witnessed. Eliana's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her water bottle and took a slow sip. Her phone buzzed again. Raphael. She's been called to the cockpit. I've spoken to the pilot and corporate. They know what happened. A sense of vindication began to swell in Eliana's chest, though it was tempered by the lingering humiliation she felt. It wasn't over yet. In the cockpit, Miss Parker stood stiffly in front of Captain Hughes and Mr. Calloway. The corporate executive Raphael had spoken to.
Miss Parker, Captain Hughes began, his voice low and authoritative. We've received a direct complaint from the executive office regarding an incident in the first-class cabin.
Miss Parker's throat tightened. Captain, I was handling a passenger who refused to move to the correct seat. Mr. Calloway narrowed his eyes. Did you verify her ticket before asking her to move? Miss Parker hesitated, her mouth opening slightly but no words coming out. She hadn't. And did you physically assault the passenger? Mr. Calloway pressed. Miss Parker's face flushed deeply. I lost my temper. It wasn't meant to. That passenger, Mr. Calloway interrupted, is Eliana Reyes. Do you know who her husband is?
Miss Parker's head tilted slightly, confusion crossing her features. No. Raphael Reyes, Captain Hughes said flatly, the owner of this airline.
The realization hit Miss Parker like a wave. She felt her knees go weak. Her mind raced back over the interaction. The dismissiveness, the slap, the humiliating words. She had assaulted the wife of the man who signed her paychecks. I didn't know, she stammered. Mr. Calloway's voice was cold. You should have. We expect professionalism, not assumptions and prejudice. You will return to Mrs. Reyes, apologize publicly, and ensure she is treated with full respect for the remainder of the flight. After landing, you will report directly to the corporate for a disciplinary hearing. Miss Parker nodded numbly, her hands trembling. Her world was already beginning to crumble. Back in the cabin, Eliana sat quietly, still absorbing everything that had happened. She felt the baby kick again and instinctively placed her hand on her belly. It was a strange comfort amid the storm of emotions.
Miss Parker re-entered the cabin, her face pale. She walked slowly to Eliana's seat, crouching slightly so she was at eye level. Mrs. Reyes, she began, her voice shaking. I want to apologize. There was a misunderstanding, and Eliana cut her off with a cold glare. Say it properly. Miss Parker swallowed hard. I'm sorry. I misjudged you. I treated you unfairly, and I should never have done that. Eliana held her gaze for a long, heavy moment before nodding. Thank you. Now, please return to your duties. Miss Parker stood, her legs wobbling slightly, and retreated to the front of the cabin. The passengers who had stayed silent during the altercation now watched with renewed interest. Some whispered among themselves, perhaps realizing the gravity of what had just occurred. But no one spoke to Eliana. Not yet. Her phone buzzed one more time. Raphael, I'm waiting at the airport when you land. Security will be there for her. I'm so sorry this happened. Eliana let out a deep breath, tears finally welling in her eyes, not from sadness or humiliation, but from sheer exhaustion. She had fought for herself, for her baby, and now things were beginning to shift.
The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It wasn't just the tension crackling in the air. It was the subtle shift in energy, like everyone was suddenly aware of the delicate balance of power tipping. The passengers who had sat in complicit silence now watched the unfolding events with morbid curiosity, some stealing glances at Eliana, others pretending to be absorbed in their phones or books. But there was no denying it. This wasn't just a simple seating dispute anymore.
Eliana sat in her seat, her back straight and her chin held high. But inside, her heart raced. Her cheek still tingled from the sting of Miss Parker's slap. But the emotional impact, the humiliation, the injustice, cut deeper than any physical pain. She rubbed her belly gently, feeling her baby shift inside her, as if sensing her distress.
Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the screen. Raphael, stay calm. They're handling it. I've instructed the captain and corporate. You're safe.
It was comforting, knowing Raphael was on top of it. But Eliana couldn't help the wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. She didn't want to be seen as a victim, but how could she not? She had been publicly humiliated, assaulted, and dismissed, all because of a flight attendant's assumptions.
The overhead intercom crackled again, breaking through her thoughts. Captain Hughes's voice filled the cabin.
Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience.
The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. People were talking now, openly speculating about what had happened. A businessman seated across the aisle leaned over to the woman next to him.
Did you see that? The flight attendant slapped her, he whispered. The woman, an older lady with silver hair. Mrs. Caldwell, Eliana remembered, nodded gravely. I saw. And no one said a word when it happened.
The businessman shifted uncomfortably, guilt flickering in his eyes. I didn't know what to do.
Mrs. Caldwell sighed, her eyes drifting to Eliana. We never do. That's the problem.
Eliana overheard the exchange but said nothing. It was a conversation she'd heard, in some form or another, many times before. The bystander effect, the way people froze in moments of injustice, unsure of how to act, afraid to get involved. It was a silent, pervasive kind of complicity. A few rows ahead, Miss Parker returned to the cabin. Her demeanor was different now. Gone was the stiff, commanding posture. Instead, she moved more cautiously, her hands fidgeting at her sides, her face pale. She paused at the galley, took a deep breath, then walked back toward Eliana's seat. Eliana could feel the shift in energy as Miss Parker approached. The whispers quieted, all eyes on the two women. Miss Parker crouched slightly beside Eliana's seat, her voice low but audible enough for nearby passengers to hear. Mrs. Rice, I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior. I misjudged you and treated you unfairly. I'm deeply sorry. Eliana met her gaze, searching for sincerity in her eyes. For a brief moment she saw it. Beneath the fear and shame, there was genuine regret. But that didn't erase what had happened. You didn't check my ticket, Eliana said, her voice steady but cold. You didn't ask questions. You assumed. Miss Parker swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. I know. Eliana leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. Do you know who my husband is? Miss Parker hesitated, then nodded. Then you know this isn't over, Eliana said, her words heavy with meaning. Miss Parker stood up, her face flushed, and quickly retreated to the front of the plane. The cabin buzzed again, the tension thick enough to cut through. Passengers whispered, exchanged glances, but still, no one spoke directly to Eliana. The intercom crackled once more.
Captain Hughes.
We're beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. Eliana buckled her seatbelt, her hands still trembling. She glanced out the window as the city came into view below, lights twinkling in the early evening sky. It should have been a peaceful moment, but her mind raced with everything that had just happened. As the plane touched down, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. Everyone waited, knowing something more was about to happen. Then, the curtain separating the first-class cabin from the galley was pulled aside, and a uniformed security officer stepped on board. His presence sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. He walked directly toward Miss Parker, who stood stiffly near the galley.
"Miss Parker," the officer said, his voice firm, "I need you to come with me."
Miss Parker's face paled.
"This is a direct order from corporate," the officer interrupted. "You'll be escorted off the plane for questioning."
The entire cabin watched as Miss Parker, now visibly shaking, was led down the aisle and off the plane. Some passengers exchanged awkward glances. Others stared straight ahead, but no one cheered or clapped. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was uncomfortable, exposing, and raw. Eliana sat silently, watching Miss Parker disappear through the exit. A strange mix of emotions washed over her. Relief, vindication, but also a deep sadness. It shouldn't have had to come to this. None of it should have happened. The security officer returned a moment later, approaching Eliana's seat. "Mrs. Reyes," he said kindly, "Mr. Rise is waiting for you at the gate. I'll escort you off the plane."
Eliana nodded, gathering her things. As she stood, the cabin grew even quieter. Passengers watched her, some with guilt in their eyes, others with curiosity, but still no one spoke.